With spaghetti straps, we have two options. We can have round spaghetti straps when we don't trim seam allowances, and these seam allowances use as a filler inside, so it looks more like a rope. Or we have flat spaghetti straps where we can play around with the width, but we do trim seam allowances, and then they lay really flat. It really is, it's up to you which one you like better. I do like both. I like to play around with them, and let's do a couple samples with different widths. Right now, I'm going to make a round spaghetti strap. And after playing around with different widths to start with, like I would start from 1 1/4, but then I wanted it a little thinner, and then I experimented with 1 inch, and then the ultimate width for me for how thin I wanted the spaghetti straps to be is 3/4. So this strap is, or this strip is cut at 3/4 inches wide. And what we want to do is the face side is going to be inside, and we're gonna start stitching probably at even smaller than 1/8. And this is where it, like we really need to play around until we get that perfect width. So when I start the spaghetti straps, what I found to be very useful is to start it at a much wider distance from the edge. And then we need to have a very uniform width when we're stitching it. So here, if you can see, I'm starting a little bit wider, going into a very narrow stitch at the edge. And let me finish this, and I'll show you what it's gonna look like when you turn it out. We have our spaghetti strap that we need to turn out, but again, I wanted to show you that the stitch is a little bit wider away from the edge, and then it turns into a more uniform stitch all the way along. And I'm also gonna trim this, we don't need it. Now I am using my loop turner. You can do this with a needle and a thread, but I actually find it a lot more difficult if you work with spaghetti straps that are pretty narrow. It's gonna be kind of harder to turn them out. So make sure to catch enough, because there's gonna be a lot of pressure now, so it doesn't break while it's inside. And what's happening is that wider opening is helping us to turn the fabric in much easier. And now keep it tight, and we just don't want to lose it inside. That's our main objective, is to pull it out first. Oh, there you go. All right, it's out. And the rest is relatively easy. And this is our round spaghetti strap. I'm still gonna go to the iron and press it so it kind of like seals it. I'm not gonna completely flatten it out, but I'm gonna make it straighter basically, and it irons out a little bit of imperfections that we see. here I've made my round spaghetti straps, and now I'm going to experiment with the flat spaghetti straps. And I've made a couple samples for you to see the difference. It's actually always a good idea to do samples for you to decide, to see how the fabrication is behaving, etc. So for example, this is a very thin flat spaghetti strap. I started with a 1 1/4 bias strip, and then I stitched it away at about, it's like a little bit, no, it's about 1/8 or so. Then I trimmed it to a little, maybe less than 1/8 up here, and turned it out and flattened it with an iron. Here's another one that's a little bit thicker. What I wanted to show you guys too, when you turn it out, you will see that it's maybe a little bit twisting, etc. So when you're at the iron, before you press it, you kind of need to flatten it with your fingers and maybe work at a small section at a time. You flattened it, you pressed it, you continue on, and then I'm ending up with a flat spaghetti strap that's a little bit wider than the previous sample. Then I went a little bit wider. Now let's see, this one is a little, it's like 5/16 or so from the edge. Again, when I turned it out, this is more tubular, and flattened it out, and it turned out to be about 1/4 flat. And my largest one, the thickest one that I did, was, well, this also kind of like shows a little more than 5/16. It's almost 3/8. I was going for 3/8. It's when you work with bias, it kind of moves and it doesn't always give you like an exact measurement. But anyway, and when I turned it out, kind of reads a little bit bigger than 1/4. Anyway, it's a good idea to, again, to make these samples to see what works for you. You can do it in like little scraps, really. It doesn't have to be long. I only did this so you could see step by step what I stitched, when it's turned out, when it's flattened. And you can even have a diary with these thicknesses, with these straps when experimentation, so you don't have to kind of do this again if you're using the same fabrication. If the fabrication is different, you're gonna have to do it all over again because you don't know how the fabric is going to behave. So let's do a pair of flat spaghetti straps now. I'm starting with my 1 1/4 bias tape. It is cut on true bias. And folding it in half, keeping the face inside, just like we did with previous straps. I'm gonna go for maybe a little bit more than 1/8 or so they look different as well, and it gives me an option to decide which ones am I gonna set into my top. So again, try to keep it uniform. Whatever you started with, just continue through until the end. So we have, yeah, it's about 1/8. So again, try to keep it uniform all the way through. we now have to trim the seam allowance to make it maybe a little smaller than this width or so. So if anything, go a little bit smaller than wider. I know we're talking about like 5/16 here, but it does make a difference. Now these straps are much easier to turn out because they're pretty wide. So these are the ones that you can definitely use the needle and a thread. So whenever you start a project, also think about the tools that you have on hand. Make your life easier, you know, making the decisions what's gonna be appropriate for your project. If you like the really thin round spaghetti straps but you don't have the loop turner, maybe settle for the flat spaghetti straps, because you'll be able to use the tools that you have on hand. Okay, now we have to turn it. Okay, now let's turn these out with the help of a loop turner. Make sure to grab enough fabric. And that's how easy it is to turn it out. Now, when you turn this out, you might see all the imperfections, and this is when you use the help of iron to really make it work for you. So now that we're gonna go to the iron, before you're gonna keep the seam allowances to one side, that's gonna be your guide, and we're going to press the seam allowances inside, flatten them, and then seal it with an iron. And we'll do it, you know, step by step to flatten the whole thing out. So let me just show it to you. I mean, it's more about feeling what's happening with the seam allowances here inside. And this is why I want you to cut it a little bit smaller than the width rather than bigger, because we don't want them to create the bulk inside. Okay, now let's flatten these straps with an iron. So I'm gonna sink a pin in the beginning of this, and now I'm keeping the seam to one side and making sure it doesn't flip around. So again, I'm working maybe small sections at a time, making sure that my seam allowances inside are nice and flat, and then moving on and continue this all the way to the end. So maybe I'll give it another press from another side. I'm sorry guys, my camera is moving because I put it in front. So it might be a little shaky. But now we have one flat spaghetti strap. I'm gonna show you the round one, and then you decide which one you're gonna use for your top.